I think the major shortcoming of Bitcoin is one that is not often used in an accusatory tone, which is the fact that the base layer doesn't have sufficient privacy. And I think that's being addressed, as are all of the other things you mentioned. Most of the things you mentioned really are growing pains. They're aspects that need to be optimized that are not, unsolvable problems. They're simply the stage of maturity that this technology is at today. Just like you couldn't really send movies on the internet in 1995, you can't really do billions of transactions yet. Fortunately, we don't need to do billions of transactions yet. And for the most part, the system as it is today is sufficient for what we need, but it's evolving and getting better. So there's layers and layers of optimization that can be applied to Bitcoin. One of the things that we do need to get right, and we need to get it right in the beginning, is privacy. One of the fundamental problems with the internet is that it didn't have sufficient privacy. Most of the encryption protocols are afterthoughts. They're layers above things like SSL or encrypted chat based on WhisperNet. And those are not sufficient. And as a result, as the internet became centralized, it allowed the world's intelligence agencies to eavesdrop en masse on humanity. And that's an unacceptable state of affairs. And it's really difficult to fix if you don't have it in the base layer. So I'm concerned about Bitcoin having sufficient privacy in the base layer, the ability for people to do transactions without those being traced. Otherwise, if we don't fix that, then Bitcoin isn't really a safe place to transact in the long term, because it will allow global surveillance of finance in a way that hasn't been done before. It depends really what you mean when you say blockchain. Mostly when people say blockchain, it means one of two things. Either people use blockchain to describe applications of Bitcoin that are non-financial in nature. So for example, using the same general concepts of a peer-to-peer flat network without intermediaries in order to do things like real estate or do access to various types of other assets or voting or social organizations, corporations, things like that. And I think that's really interesting. It's premature, but very interesting, and it will happen eventually. Another use of the word blockchain is to imply that the most interesting technology in Bitcoin is the data structure that is produced, which is called the blockchain. And the people who tend to use blockchain to mean that are mostly trying to strip away many of the characteristics of Bitcoin. The fact that it's open, borderless, peer-to-peer, neutral, and censorship resistant, and try to create alternatives of this technology that are closed, centralized, controlled, subject to censorship, where every participant is vetted and it's not open to everyone. I think those are going to be used. They're going to be used in corporate environments. I don't think they're particularly interesting, and they won't be particularly innovative. Most of the innovation will happen on the open public networks. So depending on what you mean by blockchain, there is this power struggle happening. And this power struggle is, if you like, the fundamental human weakness, which is the desire to have hierarchy, the desire to elect rulers, to appeal to authority, to look for leaders. Bitcoin introduces this environment in which there are no leaders. There are rules without rulers. And of course, some of us look at that and go, great, this could revolutionize human society. But most people look at that and go, let's elect a leader. And they instinctively want to find someone to trust and to make the authority, which runs counter to the whole thing. So from the very early days of this technology, just like from the very early days of the internet, people tried to centralize and control and tame this open and slightly chaotic architecture. I think that's where the power struggle comes. Yeah, one of the challenges with not having rulers is that in traditional hierarchical systems, a debate has an end point. meaning that you can gather all the people in the room and they can all have an opinion, and those opinions will be discussed and debated. Even in the most meritocratic and open of organizations, at some point, someone in the room has the authority to say, all right, I've heard and considered all the opinions. We are going to go with plan A. In Bitcoin, there is no such person. No one has the authority. Many are trying to do that. Many try to say, okay, stop debating, we're going to go with plan A. But it's not an end to the debate, because no one has the authority to impose that opinion on everybody else. Consensus, which is the fundamental emergent property of these network-based systems, is really something difficult to achieve. Consensus means that the vast majority, and we're talking upwards of 95%, of the participants in the system have to come to complete agreement on the rules that operate. If they don't, they end up being cleaved off the network as a minority. And achieving consensus at 95%, I mean, think of traditional democratic systems. Most votes are secured with a 51% majority. And the reason for that is because otherwise you can't get anything done. It's very difficult to change the rules. In some cases, you have the concept of a supermajority. For example, let's say the US Senate. If you want to end debate on a topic, you need 60% effectively to stop debate. And then you have like very serious questions, which are constitutional issues. And for constitutional issues, you need a 75% majority plus verification by all of the states or something like that in a federal system. Well, if you think of Bitcoin, its consensus rules, and this applies to all open blockchains, are a constitution. But they're a constitution that has a much higher burden of consensus. You actually need to hit in excess of 95% agreement by the participants in order to proceed with a rule change. And for simple rule changes that don't affect the fundamental principles, or people don't feel that they affect the fundamental principles, that's achievable. But for major rule changes that affect the fundamental principles of the network, it's impossible to achieve. There will always be a significant minority who absolutely refuse to follow those rules. Now, how do you get outlet from that? In democratic systems, when you fail to reach consensus on the governance of a country, the outlet is secession. You take your state, in fact, if you look at American politics, every few years there's a movement to take Texas and make it an independent country, or California, or now in Europe we see that with Catalonia, or the Basque region, and we see these secession movements. These are failures to achieve governance at scale, and part of the problem with doing that in a system that's geographically bound is that you force the people who live there to come with you. But with network-based systems, you can secede from the main network and take with you only the people who want to follow the new rules, and everybody else remains where they are. So it's actually a fair way of resolving differences. So there's two ways of achieving agreement. One is you have to achieve a very high degree of consensus, upwards of 95%. And the other is, eventually, if the debate is not resolved, some people are going to say, well, we're going to take our computers and our money and our effort and passion and creativity, and we're going to build another system that follows all the rules except this one that we disagree with. And that's okay, because they can. And you can have a system with lots of different blockchains and lots of different networks, and no one's forced to participate. Think of it a bit like a game of basketball. There's 20 people in a basketball arena, and 15 of them want to play hard. They want to, fouls, maybe get a bit physical with your game, but 5 of them don't. They want a softer game. So how do you resolve that? Very simple. You've got 2 hoops. You play 2 games. Well, we have infinite hoops. We can just keep doing that. Everybody can have a voice. Of course, if you take your ball and decide to play by yourself and nobody follows you, you're playing a minority game, which isn't as much fun. And in the case of these cryptocurrencies, that means you may end up on a network that doesn't have much activity. The token that's used may not have as much value, but that's okay. You get to choose. Well, the vast majority of questionable activity, questionable of course being a matter of perspective, occurs on the US dollar. And it occurs through the banking channels that are otherwise supposedly regulated to prevent money laundering and things like that. Rational people looking at the real state of the world know that the vast majority of funding of terrorist organizations happens by state actors. And the vast majority of money laundering happens by banks. Of course, money laundering happens by banks. They are the best positioned to do that. And they have a license to do that. And in most cases, when they are caught doing it, they get a slap on the wrist and they continue business as usual. For the illusion of protection from those activities, we pay the price of keeping billions in poverty. Corrupt money will always find a way. And corrupt people will always use whatever mechanism they have in order to transmit money. The truth is that only a tiny, tiny fraction of that kind of activity actually happens with these digital currencies. They're too small, too cumbersome, too complicated, too technical. It's much easier to walk into your local bank, dump $1 billion on the table, and corrupt everyone around you, from the lowest level police person to the Minister of Finance, and this happens routinely in most countries. Corruption is an inherent aspect of human nature. Corruption uses money as a tool of power because all tools of power are used by those who have the means and the incentives and the motivation to use them. And they will, of course, use Bitcoin. If they couldn't use Bitcoin, arguably it wouldn't be money. Of course they will use Bitcoin, just like they use dollars, rubles, and yen. The question is, how far are we willing as a society to go to use money specifically as the tool to control corruption when we have failed to control corruption in our banking system? We have failed to control corruption through democratic institutions. We have failed to control corruption through all of the other mechanisms. And the question we should ask is not only are we achieving the goals of controlling corruption with these mechanisms, but what are the side effects? What is the cost we pay? And the cost we pay today is horrendous. The cost is leaving billions of people, some estimates up to 4 billion people, completely outside the banking system, and mired in poverty, just so we can maintain the illusion of a just and clean society, which really is quite an illusion. I don't buy that. And so when people say that corrupt money will flow into Bitcoin, of course it will. Bitcoin is better money. It's fast, it's cheap, it's secure, and it's global. And it will flow into all forms of money that have those capabilities and characteristics. Turning money into something that is slow, unavailable to most, expensive, and insecure in order to stop corruption just ends up hurting a lot of people, and it doesn't end up stopping corruption. I think there are a number of examples. It's important to realize that we're still in the very early stages of this technology. And one of the things that happens in early stage technologies is that they're mostly accessible and used by the most privileged members of society. So let's not kid ourselves. Right now, this technology is not in the hands of everyone. It's very concentrated in the hands of those who are affluent, literate, free, and able to express their power in this way, right? And that's a tiny minority of the population. Not unlike the first automobiles were only accessible to the super rich. The first electrified homes were the homes of the rich. The first planes were only used by the rich, et cetera, et cetera. So similarly, the first cell phones, the first access to internet connectivity. But gradually, these technologies reach a tipping point where the cost per unit drops to such an extent that it can become a mass market opportunity. And then it gravitates to the people with the most need, and those are not the richest. So today, for example, if you see someone holding a cell phone, you don't assume they're rich. When I had my first cell phone, it was a status symbol. Holding a cell phone made you look important. Today, important people don't hold cell phones. They have secretaries to do that. In fact, the status symbol is to not hold your own cell phone, but to have a gaggle and entourage behind you who handle your calls. The plumber answers his phone. The boss doesn't. And today you'll find this technology spreading to every part of the world, even in the most remote places in the world. You'll see a solar panel and a Nokia phone in the middle of the Amazon jungle. It's an empowering technology because the unit has dropped in cost to less than $10. And at that price point, the power it brings individuals can be achieved by anyone. What happens when we do that with banking, with cryptocurrency? We're not there yet. There are some interesting emergent phenomena that are happening already. One of them is the use of these currencies for oppressed populations who are in a state of crisis or who are under constraints where they cannot use money legally. A couple of examples come to mind. One is in the state of Venezuela, where there's been a hyperinflation crisis that has unfolded over the last 3 to 4 years, largely self-inflicted by the government, and has ravaged society, has destroyed the fabric of society, and led to famine, poverty, widespread death at very young ages, this horrible collapse of social order. Some people there are using cryptocurrencies in order to preserve some safety and security, sometimes even to buy food from other countries and have it imported into Venezuela. Still, it's mostly the rich in that country who can do that. Another great example, which I found fascinating, was a group of women who live in Afghanistan, where ownership of assets by women is forbidden. Women are effectively legally children and controlled by their husbands or fathers as guardians. They have no independent adult status, ever. They can never acquire it. They're forbidden from owning property. They're forbidden from owning bank accounts. They're forbidden from owning cars. They're forbidden from owning anything. And certain people have tried to find ways to use cryptocurrency to allow women in Afghanistan not only to earn money using skills they might have, but also to keep that money and sometimes keep it secretly from their husbands or fathers who don't know about that, at great personal risk, of course. There's a particularly interesting project that used Bitcoin for a short period of time. It wasn't that successful in the early days, but still, it's interesting as a model, which taught girls how to code, how to write software, and sell that service to developed nations, earn money directly in Bitcoin, and use that to free themselves from oppressive husbands or fathers and things like that. That's an example where things are beginning to get interesting. It's still early days, but there's something interesting about the possibility to own a completely intangible asset that is invisible, yet one that you can use powerfully to gain freedom, to gain, for example, transportation, shelter, exit from a difficult situation. Think about all the refugees streaming across borders out of war zones that Western nations have created, trying to find safety, and they have to leave everything behind. Well, some of those refugees are crossing the border with 12 words memorized in their head, and those 12 words unlock an amount of Bitcoin that no one can trace they're carrying because they're not carrying it. It's simply a memory. And as they cross the border, they leave all their belongings behind, but they take their money with them in their head. And it's impossible to stop them from doing that. And who would want to anyway? It gives them the ability to preserve some of their autonomy and freedom as they move to a new country. So I can see how these technologies could really change the balance of power between individuals in the state, between oppressed and dispossessed individuals and those oppressing them. So that gives me quite a bit of hope. We're also seeing very practical applications, for example, charitable giving using this. Because a lot of these cryptocurrencies as an emergent phenomenon have gained tremendously in value, just like internet stocks did in the 1990s and early 2000s, Charities that have received charitable donations in Bitcoin, for example, treat that almost like an endowment, which gains in value and then gives them a steady stream of income that they can use for charitable purposes. It's still early, but I think it's very promising where we're going with this. I think it's tremendously efficient. Right now, we can secure a global network of transactions against even a coalition of nation states attacking it. So at the moment, we are securing a global payments network for an amount of energy that seems like it's a lot, but it is the same amount of energy that we would need to use in order to secure this global network when everyone's participating. You don't actually need more energy in the future than you do today, and it certainly doesn't grow as a percentage of the transactions happening or anything like that. There's a misunderstanding that the energy that's used in Bitcoin is per transaction, but it's not. It's the energy you need to secure a global network against global scale attacks. Think of it as building a massive warehouse-sized, super secure vault. Well, if you go and park a tricycle in it instead of 1,000 Ferraris, it kind of looks like an immense waste of money that you built this enormous vault. But it's secure enough that it can actually do a lot more interesting things. We have a very secure infrastructure because of the energy that's being expended. And what that energy gives us is an investment in the immutability of the ledger, which is one of the securing principles for decentralization. So it's not wasted energy. It's energy that's invested in security. The difference is that with these cryptocurrencies, you can actually see the energy that goes into it and measure it directly. When a bank has a building tower with all the lights on, when its 600 employees from that branch travel on an automobile spewing diesel fumes all over the city every day, you can't see that. You can't relate it to the fact that you just did a Visa transaction. Behind the scenes, there were 1,000 data centers and 600,000 employees commuting every day to work in cubicles in air-conditioned offices in hot cities. You don't see that energy at all, but it's there. In fact, on the basis of how many transactions this network can do and how secure it can be, it might end up being one of the most efficient payment networks we've ever built. So recently in Bitcoin, there was a debate that has raged for a while about how to best expand the capacity of the network without sacrificing its decentralization. And in that debate, several different factions emerged, and these factions tried to sway the debate and achieve overwhelming consensus for their pet outcome, for their chosen approach. And one of those factions claimed to have overwhelming support, attempted to force a change in the rules, discovered they didn't have overwhelming support, and then the rules didn't change, proving that one of the things that happens with this technology is if you lack the overwhelming support of consensus, the rules simply remain the same, and the status quo continues. These systems are resistant to manipulation. And manipulation, whether it's benign or malicious, I'm not casting judgment on it, but simply if you do not have overwhelming agreement, you cannot move forward. Ironically, some of the people look at this and say, oh, so this faction lost, therefore that means the other faction won. No, the other faction didn't win either. The other faction just happened to support the status quo more, and so the status quo just continued happening. If the other faction had tried to go it alone and change the rules in a way that didn't have consensus, they would have lost and have discovered that the consensus rules are not easy to change. Resistance to change without overwhelming consensus is the fundamental principle, and more and more groups are going to discover it as they try to attack the rules or change the rules or make changes they think have broad consensus, and then they discover that simply the market isn't supporting them. Obama was wrong. Everybody's not walking around with a Swiss bank account in their pocket. Everyone's walking around with a fully fledged Swiss bank in their pocket. Not just one bank account, but a bank that can generate 1 billion bank accounts a second, as my smartphone can do with Bitcoin. It's much more powerful than even he thinks. What happens then? The middle class suddenly acquires the same capabilities of a multinational corporation and the rich who have been cheating on their taxes for decades. And somehow now it's a concern. Wasn't a concern when they were doing it, but suddenly now it's an urgent concern and we must put a stop to this. There are other ways of achieving the government goals. The idea that you must eviscerate financial privacy, submit everyone to totalitarian financial surveillance just to fulfill the narrow government interest of taxation is fascist. And I think we can do better than that. There are many ways that we can tax that don't involve income tax or the ability to see every transaction that every person does. In fact, if you give government that power, democracy gets eroded really fast. One example is consumption taxes, which have been used in many places. Once you have programmable money, you can also have use taxes that are much more specific. So for example, I can't pay for every mile that I drive my car or my self-driving car drives me because the payment mechanisms are too complicated, slow, and expensive. But with cryptocurrencies, I can. I can pay for every centimeter that my car moves. And so the roads get paid for themselves, right? And you can pay for schools and other things the same way. But let's not kid ourselves. When people ask me how are we going to pay for the roads, my answer is, you mean how are we going to pay for the wars? Because if you think your taxes are paying for roads, you haven't looked at a government budget. At least in the United States, 60% of the budget goes to the combined Department of Defense, military spending, veteran affairs, nuclear weapons, the maintenance of those, and the debt payments for all the wars we've been fighting for the last 100 years. So what are your taxes paying for? They're not paying for roads, as anybody who's had to drive on those pitiful roads will tell you. We are going to have a reckoning, but we're going to have a reckoning because the system as it is was already falling apart. It was not serving citizens. And in some countries, yes, it does. Here in Sweden, it does. You actually do get health care for the incredible taxes that you pay. But that's an aberration. That's an exception. The vast majority of the world doesn't work that way. Most people pay taxes and get very little in return other than enriching their rulers or paying for war. So yes, it will force a change in society, but that change was happening anyway because of multinationals, because of tax evasion by the rich. And the fact that we are empowering the entire middle class to have financial privacy is not the reason the tax system is failing.